The letter arrived on the 12th anniversary of his father's death, exactly as the old man's lawyer had promised it would. Sungmin recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, his father's, though the man had been dead for over a decade. Inside was a single address, 3 streets from his own headquarters, and 7 words: "The promise ends the day she turns 12. Sungmin stared at the page, his hands unsteady for the first time in years. He had searched for Soo-min across 4 countries, convinced she'd vanished to escape him. He had never once considered that his own father might have been the reason he could never find her, or that his father had known exactly where she was the entire time. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful Korean mafia stories filled with unforgettable family drama, emotional reunions, shocking secrets, and cinematic storytelling, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Sungmin read the letter a second time, then a third, searching the careful, deliberate handwriting for some hidden meaning he might have missed. His father had never been a sentimental man. Every decision, every instruction, every word he'd ever committed to paper had served a specific purpose. This letter was no different, which meant the timing wasn't coincidence. It meant his father had planned this exact moment, down to the day, more than a decade in advance. He picked up the phone and called the only person still alive who might explain it. "Attorney Park," he said, the moment the call connected. "I need you to tell me exactly what my father instructed you to do with this letter, and I need you to tell me now." There was a pause on the line, the particular hesitation of a man who had been dreading this exact call for 12 years. "Your father left very specific instructions," Attorney Park said carefully. "The letter was to be delivered to you on this date, and only this date, regardless of any request you might have made to receive it earlier. I asked him once, years ago, why the timing mattered so much. He told me some promises only mean something if you keep them exactly as made, down to the day." "What promise?" Sungmin said, his voice low and controlled in the way that had made grown men in his organization go quiet with fear. "What exactly did my father promise, and to whom?" "That," Attorney Park said, "is a conversation you need to have with Mrs. Yoon. I only handled the paperwork. She handled everything else." "Then tell me this much," Sungmin said. "Did my father know Soo-min's location this entire time? Every year I came to him, frustrated, certain I'd exhausted every possible lead. Was he sitting across from me, already knowing exactly where she was?" Attorney Park was quiet for a moment. "I believe so," he said finally. "I was never told the specifics, but I handled enough of your father's private correspondence to understand that very little happened in his final years without his direct knowledge. If he seemed sympathetic to your search, Sungmin, I suspect that sympathy was genuine. I also suspect it never once changed his decision to let you keep searching in the wrong direction." 12 years, Sungmin said quietly. "He watched me search for 12 years. He watched you search for all those years," Attorney Park agreed quietly, "because he believed, rightly or wrongly, that your searching was safer for everyone involved than your finding." Yoon had been a fixture in Sungmin's life for as long as he could remember, present at every family gathering, every quiet dinner, every difficult year following his mother's death when he was still a boy. She had never once, in all that time, given him reason to doubt her loyalty. Sitting across from her now, in the small, immaculately kept house she'd lived in for as long as he could remember, he found himself searching her familiar face for signs of the deception he now understood she'd carried for over a decade. "You knew," he said, setting the letter on the table between them. "This whole time, every search I ever launched, every private investigator, every dead end I hit searching for Soo-min, you knew exactly where she was." Yoon didn't flinch, didn't reach for the letter, didn't offer the immediate apology he half expected. "Every dead end you hit," she said, "I created. Your father asked me to, before he died, and I gave him my word I would honor that request until the day it was no longer necessary to keep." "Why?" Sungmin said, the single word carrying 12 years of frustration behind it. "Why would my father spend his final years making certain I never found the mother of my own child?" "Because he was trying to keep her alive," Mrs. Yoon said quietly, "both of them. And because he understood something about the danger surrounding your family that you were too young, and too grieving, to understand at the time." 12 years earlier, in the same small house, a considerably younger Mrs. Yoon had sat across from Sungmin's father, watching the old man's hands shake as he read a report he'd been dreading for weeks. "The Song family knows," Cho Dae-woo had said, his voice heavy with a fear Mrs. Yoon had rarely witnessed from him in over 20 years of loyal service. They know Soo-min is pregnant. They know the child will carry our bloodline. You believe they'll come for the child, Mrs. Yoon had said, though it wasn't really a question. I believe, Daewoo said, that the Song family has spent 18 years waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. They lost their own heir the same year they took my wife from me. I have always known they would eventually come looking for a way to balance that loss against our family, and a child too young to protect herself is exactly the kind of balance they'd consider fair. Sungmin would protect her, Mrs. Yoon had said. He would protect them both. Protect them from what, exactly? Daewoo had said, something sharp entering his voice. He doesn't yet understand what protecting someone in our world actually costs. He would move his men openly. He would make certain everyone in the city knew Soo-min carried something precious to him, because that is how he was raised to think, that visible strength keeps people safe. He has not yet learned that visible strength simply tells your enemies exactly where to aim. Mrs. Yoon had said nothing, because she understood he was right, however much it pained her to admit it. Sungmin is 23 years old and drowning in grief he hasn't finished processing, Daewoo had said. He would try to protect them by making our enemies aware of exactly how much they mattered to him, and in doing so, he would make them the single most valuable target the Song family could ask for. He'd looked up at her then, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had already made an impossible decision and simply needed someone else to help him carry it. The only way to keep that child safe is if no one, including my own son, knows where to find her. Not until she's old enough that the Song family's original grievance no longer applies under the old code they still claim to honor. 12 years. That's how long their tradition requires before a bloodline debt expires, and Soo-min agreed to this. Soo-min suggested it herself, Daewoo said. She understood the danger better than I expected her to. She asked only for my word that Sungmin would never be told she left to protect him from a war he didn't yet know he was fighting. Yoon had studied the old man carefully, searching for any hesitation, any second thoughts he might be hiding beneath his usual composure. You understand what this will cost him, she'd said. 12 years believing the woman he loved simply left him. That kind of grief changes a person permanently, Daewoo. You're not simply protecting a child. You're deciding on his behalf which pain he's allowed to carry and which pain he isn't. I know exactly what I'm deciding, Daewoo had said, his voice breaking slightly for the only time in that entire conversation. I buried my wife because the Song family believed erasing her was an acceptable price for whatever grievance they carried against my father's generation. I will not bury a granddaughter I haven't even met yet, simply because my son wasn't ready to make the same sacrifice I'm making right now on his behalf. When the 12 years end, he will hate me for this. I have made my peace with that. I would rather have his hatred and her survival than his love and her grave. Back in the present, Sungmin sat in stunned silence, 12 years of assumptions collapsing at once. He had spent over a decade believing Soo-min abandoned him, believing she'd simply decided their relationship, their unborn child, wasn't worth the complications of his world. He had grieved that betrayal privately, quietly, never once suspecting the truth was so much more complicated than heartbreak. The Song family, he said slowly. They're the ones who killed my mother. Yes, Mrs. Yoon said. And my father believed they would come after my own child, the same way they came after her. He believed it enough to spend the final years of his life making absolutely certain they never had the chance to find out she existed, Mrs. Yoon said. I have honored that promise every day since his death, redirecting every investigator you hired, quietly discouraging every lead that came too close to the truth, because I gave him my word, and because I believed, and still believe, that the danger was real. Is it still real? Sungmin asked. Right now, today, with the promise officially ended, is there still a threat? Mrs. Yoon was quiet for a long moment, and that silence told him more than any answer could have. I don't know, she admitted finally. The tradition your father described says 12 years closes the debt, but traditions only hold as much weight as the people honoring them choose to give. I have spent 12 years hoping the Song family forgot this debt entirely. I have no way of knowing whether today, of all days, is the day they remember it instead. You should have told me sooner, Sungmin said quietly. Even if the danger was real, even if my father genuinely believed silence was the safer path forward. I am not the same 23-year-old who buried his mother and made every enemy in this city aware of exactly how much it wounded him. I have spent 12 years learning restraint, Mrs. Yoon, whether either of you ever gave me the credit for it. I know, Mrs. Yoon said quietly. "I've watched you become that man from a distance. 12 years of admiring exactly the kind of restraint your father hoped you would eventually develop. And 12 years of wondering whether telling you sooner might have actually been the safer choice after all. I made my decision based on the son I remembered burying his mother. I did not always remember to account for the son you were actually becoming in the years since." "Then account for him now," Sungmin said. "Tell me everything, and let me decide for myself how to protect what's mine, instead of deciding it for me the way you and my father always have." 3 streets from Sungmin's headquarters, in a modest apartment above a small tailoring shop she'd built from nothing over the past decade, Soo-min was finishing her daughter's breakfast before school, entirely unaware that the careful, protected life she'd constructed was about to collide with everything she'd spent 12 years keeping separate. "Mom, can Hannah come over after school?" her daughter asked, referring to a friend rather than herself, though the coincidence of shared names had amused Soo-min quietly for years. She had named her own daughter after her grandmother, never imagining how many small, ordinary echoes of ordinary life she'd end up building around a secret this large. "If her mother says it's all right," Soo-min said, sliding a plate across the small kitchen table. "Finish eating, you'll be late." Her daughter ate quickly, chattering about a school project, entirely unbothered by anything beyond the ordinary concerns of an almost 12-year-old, and Soo-min found herself, as she often did, quietly grateful for exactly how ordinary that concern was. She had built this life carefully, deliberately, every choice designed to keep her daughter's world small enough that danger would never have reason to find it. She glanced toward the window as her daughter gathered her school bag, and something made her pause. A car she didn't recognize sat parked across the street, idling, though no one appeared to be exiting it. She watched it for a long moment, an old, familiar unease stirring somewhere beneath her ribs, the particular instinct of a woman who had spent 12 years training herself to notice exactly this kind of small, unexplained detail. It wasn't the first time she'd felt watched over the years. In the early days, right after the arrangement with Cho Dae-woo had been settled, she'd startled at every unfamiliar face, every car that lingered a moment too long on her street. Time had eventually worn that vigilance down into something quieter, more manageable, though it had never fully disappeared. She had simply learned to live alongside it, the way a person learns to live with a scar that aches only when the weather changes. Today, watching the unfamiliar car sit motionless across the street, that old vigilance rose sharply back to the surface, sharper than it had been in years. She told herself it was nothing. She told her daughter to hurry, walked her the 2 blocks to school, the way she did every morning, and returned to her shop trying to convince herself that today was simply an ordinary Tuesday, indistinguishable from any other day in the careful, quiet life she'd built 3 streets away from a man she'd once loved enough to disappear for. Back at Mrs. Yoon's house, Sungmin stood, the letter still in his hand, 12 years of grief and confusion finally resolving into something considerably more urgent. "Give me the address," he said firmly. "Sungmin, give me the address, or I will find it myself within the hour, and you know exactly how thoroughly I'm capable of searching when I finally have a reason to look in the right direction." Mrs. Yoon studied him for a long moment, weighing 12 years of careful protection against the reality that the promise had, technically, already ended. "If you go to her today," she said slowly, "you need to understand you may not simply be reuniting with the woman you lost. You may be walking directly into whatever danger my silence has kept away from her for 12 years. If the Song family has been waiting for this exact date the way your father feared they might, your presence there could be the very thing that finally draws their attention. Then I need to get there before they do," Sungmin said. Mrs. Yoon reached for a small notepad, wrote the address in careful, deliberate handwriting, and slid it across the table toward him with visible reluctance. 3 streets from your own headquarters," she said. "She's been close enough to see the top floor of your building from her kitchen window this entire time, and neither of you ever knew it." She paused before letting go of the paper fully, her grip tightening for just a moment longer. "One more thing," she said. "When you see her, remember that she made this sacrifice willingly, 12 years ago, without anyone forcing her hand. Whatever anger you're carrying toward your father, toward me, do not let it land on her before you understand exactly how much she gave up to keep your daughter alive. She deserves your gratitude today, Sungmin, not your grief arriving 12 years too late and looking for somewhere convenient to settle." Sungmin took the address without responding, though her words stayed with him long after he'd left the small, familiar house behind. Sungmin left Mrs. Yoon's house within minutes, his driver already waiting, the address burning in his pocket like something dangerous. He had spent 12 years building an empire specifically designed to make him untouchable, and in all that time, the one thing he'd never managed to protect was the single truth that mattered most. As his car pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed with a message from his head of security, the timing landing with the particular weight of coincidence that experience had taught him never to trust. Unusual surveillance activity reported near your headquarters this morning. Unknown vehicle, parked and idling for over an hour, matching a pattern our team hasn't seen since the Song family's last confirmed movement 11 years ago. Advise caution. Sungmin stared at the message, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that Mrs. Yoon's fear hadn't been theoretical at all. Whatever the Song family had been waiting for, it seemed they too understood exactly what today's date meant. And somewhere 3 streets away, a woman he hadn't seen in 12 years was about to discover that the careful, protected life she'd built for her daughter was no longer as invisible as she'd spent an entire decade believing it to be. He told his driver to move faster, aware, for the first time in 12 years of careful, controlled searching, that speed itself might now be the only thing standing between everything he'd just learned and everything he still stood to lose, 3 streets away, closer than he had ever imagined possible. Soo-min noticed the car again just after she'd returned from walking her daughter to school, the same idling silhouette parked half a block down from her shop window now instead of directly across the street, close enough that she could make out 2 figures inside, neither of them moving to leave. She had spent 12 years training herself not to overreact to every unfamiliar detail in her small, carefully built life. But 12 years of discipline hadn't erased the instinct entirely, and this morning, that instinct was screaming loud enough that she found herself reaching for the phone Cho Dae-woo had given her years earlier, the one she'd never once had reason to use. Her hand was still hovering over the screen when the shop's front bell rang, and she looked up to find a man standing in her doorway she hadn't seen in 12 years, breathing hard, his expression a devastating mixture of relief and heartbreak she'd spent over a decade imagining and never once expected to actually witness. "Sungmin," she whispered. For a moment, the shop around them seemed to disappear entirely, the bolts of fabric stacked along the walls, the sewing machine still humming quietly in the back room, the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday morning she'd spent 12 years carefully constructing. None of it mattered against the simple, overwhelming fact of him standing there, real and breathing and finally, impossibly present. She had imagined this moment more times than she could count over the years, usually late at night, when the discipline she maintained during daylight hours grew harder to sustain. In some versions she ran to him immediately, 12 years of longing overriding every careful precaution she'd built her life around. In others, she turned him away entirely, protecting the fragile safety she'd constructed at whatever cost to her own heart. Standing here now, facing the actual moment rather than its imagined echo, she found herself capable of neither extreme, caught instead in the particular paralysis of a person confronting something too large to process in a single breath. Neither of them moved for a long moment, 12 years of separation collapsing into the small space between the shop's front counter and the door, every rehearsed explanation she'd never had reason to deliver suddenly meaningless in the face of him standing there, real, older, unmistakably the man she'd loved enough to disappear for. "You've been 3 streets away," he said, his voice unsteady. "This entire time." "I know," Soo-min said. "I've walked past your building more times than I could ever count. I used to stand at the corner sometimes, just far enough to see the lights on the top floor, and tell myself you were safe, and that was supposed to be enough." "It wasn't," Sungmin said, "for either of us." She wanted to close the distance between them, wanted 12 years of careful discipline to finally give way to everything she'd suppressed for so long. But the phone in her hand, the unfamiliar car still idling down the street, the particular urgency in Sungmin's own posture, told her this reunion wasn't happening on the timeline either of them would have chosen. "You know," she said slowly, watching his face carefully, "about the promise, about why I left." "My father's letter arrived this morning," Sungmin said. "Mrs. Yoon told me everything else, the Song family, the danger, 12 years of you carrying this alone because my father decided that was the safest way to protect us both." He crossed the small shop, closing the distance she hadn't managed to close herself. "I am so sorry it took this long. I am sorry you carried this by yourself for 12 years, believing I would have made it worse." "I never believed that," Soo-min said. "I believed your father, and I believed the danger, and I made a choice I would make again if I had to, even knowing what it cost both of us." Her eyes finally softened, 12 years of careful control giving way to something raw, But I am glad, more than I know how to say, that you finally know the truth. The bell above the door rang again, sharper this time, and both of them turned toward it with the shared instinct of people who had spent years, in very different ways, learning to read danger before it fully announced itself. Two men stood in the doorway, neither of them bothering to disguise the weapons visible beneath their jackets, their posture carrying the particular calm of people who had done this exact kind of work many times before. Chua Sungmin, the taller of the two, said, his tone almost conversational. And the woman we've been asked to locate for considerably longer than we expected this search to take. How convenient, finding you both in the same room. Sungmin stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between the men and Soo-min, his voice dropping into the low, controlled register that had made grown men in his own organization go quiet with fear. The debt closed today, he said. 12 years, exactly as your family's own tradition requires. Whatever grievance the Song family believes it still owed, you're standing here in violation of the very code you claim to honor. Traditions are flexible, the second man said, when the people enforcing them decide flexibility serves them better. Then you're not here on behalf of your family's honor, Sungmin said. You're here because someone decided honor was inconvenient today. I'd like to know who gave that order, because I don't believe it came from anyone actually authorized to override a code that old. Something flickered across the taller man's face, a hesitation Sungmin recognized immediately as uncertainty rather than confidence. Whatever orders had sent these two men here, they weren't entirely comfortable carrying them out. You're stalling, the shorter man said, though his own voice carried less conviction than his partner's had a moment earlier. Whatever debt your father believed existed, we were told it's still owed. We don't answer to whatever tradition you're quoting. We answer to the person who sent us. Then tell me who that is, Sungmin said, because a debt this specific, honored this precisely for 12 years by everyone else in your organization, doesn't simply get overridden by two men acting on a whim. Someone gave you a name, a location, and an order this morning. I want to know who. The taller man's jaw tightened, some internal calculation playing out behind his eyes. That's not information either of us has, he said finally. We received instructions through an intermediary, no name attached. Where's my daughter right now? Soo-min said suddenly, her voice sharp with a fear that cut through everything else in the room. If you know enough to find this shop, you know she's at school, 3 blocks from here, alone. The taller man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and in that shift, Soo-min understood with terrible clarity that the answer wasn't reassuring. She won't be alone for very much longer, he said. Soo-min moved before either of the men could react, snatching her keys from the counter, already halfway to the back door before Sungmin caught her arm. I'll go get her, he said. You know this neighborhood better than my security team does. Call Mrs. Yoon, tell her exactly what's happening, and let her reach my head of security faster than either of us could manage alone. I will not let anything happen to her. You don't even know what she looks like, Soo-min said, desperation cracking through her usual careful composure entirely. Then come with me, Sungmin said. But we go now, together, and we let these two explain to whoever sent them why their target walked out the front door instead of waiting to be collected. They reached the small elementary school 3 streets away in under 4 minutes, Sungmin's driver navigating traffic with a controlled urgency that matched the fear radiating from both passengers in the back seat. Soo-min was out of the car before it had fully stopped, sprinting toward the front entrance with the particular speed of a mother running on pure instinct, rather than any conscious plan. She found her daughter exactly where she should have been, standing in the small courtyard during morning recess, entirely unaware that anything in her ordinary day had shifted at all. Soo-min's relief nearly buckled her knees, and she crossed the courtyard quickly, gathering her daughter into her arms with a fierceness that clearly startled the girl. Mom, what's wrong? Nothing, Soo-min said, forcing her voice steady despite her racing heart. I just missed you. We're going to take a little trip today, all right? Just the two of us. Well, she glanced back toward Sungmin, who had stopped a respectful distance away, watching the reunion with an expression caught somewhere between relief and overwhelming emotion. Not just the two of us, actually. There's someone I need you to meet. Her daughter studied the unfamiliar man across the courtyard, the particular weariness of a child sensing an unusual amount of tension in an otherwise ordinary morning. Who is he? Soo-min knelt down, taking her daughter's hands, 12 years of careful preparation for this exact moment, finally arriving all at once. That, she said gently, is your father. Her daughter's eyes widened slightly, processing the sentence with the particular seriousness children reserve for information they instinctively understand matters more than their mother's careful tone was letting on. The one you said was far away doing important work? Yes, Soo-min said. Except it turns out he wasn't quite as far away as either of us believed. And the reason I never told him where we were, that's a longer story. One I promised to tell you properly, once we're somewhere safer than a school courtyard. Are we in danger? Her daughter asked, with a bluntness that caught Soo-min off guard. We were, this morning, Soo-min said, deciding honesty mattered more than comfort in this particular moment. Your father came to make sure we weren't anymore. That's part of why everything feels strange right now. I promise you, once we're settled, I'll explain everything. The reunion happened in fragments over the following hour, Sungmin's security team arriving to secure the school and escort all three of them to a safe location while Mrs. Yoon worked to determine exactly who had authorized the Song family's men to break 12 years of tradition on the very day it was meant to expire. Sungmin's daughter, whose name he learned within minutes was Yerin, studied him throughout the drive with the same careful, evaluating attention her mother had shown him 12 years earlier, though considerably more guarded given everything happening around her. Mom said you didn't know about me, Yerin said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the car. Is that true? It's true, Sungmin said. I found out this morning. I have spent 12 years wondering what happened to your mother, and I never once imagined the answer included you. Did it make you sad, not knowing? Every single day, Sungmin said honestly, aware that a child this perceptive deserved a real answer rather than a comfortable one. I used to imagine what your mother's life looked like, wherever she was. I never once imagined it included someone exactly like you, and I think that's the part I regret most about the years we lost. Not simply missing your mother, missing you before I even knew there was a you to miss. Are you angry at her for not telling you? Sungmin considered the question carefully, aware that his answer mattered considerably more than the casual tone of a child's question might suggest. No, he said finally. I understand why she made the choice she did, even though it cost both of us 12 years we can't get back. She was protecting you, in the only way she believed she could. That's not something to be angry about. That's something to be grateful for. Yerin studied him for a long moment longer, something in her expression softening slightly. You have the same eyebrows as me, she said finally, with the blunt observational honesty only a child could offer. Despite everything, despite the dangers still unresolved somewhere behind them, Sungmin felt something in his chest ease slightly at the small, unexpected warmth of the observation. 12 years of grief, of assuming he would never have this exact kind of ordinary, unremarkable moment with a child of his own, seemed to loosen its grip just slightly, replaced by the strange, disorienting realization that he was, quite suddenly, someone's father, and that the small stranger sitting across from him had already begun, in her own careful way, to decide whether he deserved that title. By early afternoon, Mrs. Yoon had traced the authorization for the morning's attempted abduction to its source, and the answer, when it arrived, unsettled Sungmin considerably more than a straightforward act of Song family aggression would have. It wasn't the Song family's current leadership, Mrs. Yoon said, meeting Sungmin and Soo-min at the secure estate his security team had relocated them to. The elder who currently holds authority over their organization had no knowledge of this morning's operation. He's furious, in fact, that two of his own men acted without his authorization on a debt he considered closed the moment the 12 years expired. Then who sent them? Sungmin asked. Someone within their organization who disagreed with the elder's decision to honor the tradition, Mrs. Yoon said. A faction that believes the old grievance against your family was never properly settled, regardless of what the 12-year code technically requires. I've arranged a meeting this evening between you and the Song elder directly, so he can address this personally and make clear that his organization does not sanction what happened this morning. Sungmin considered this, something uneasy settling behind his composed expression. I want Soo-min and Yerin present as well, he said. If this is truly ending today, I want it to end completely, witnessed by everyone this debt was ever supposed to concern. The meeting took place that evening in a private room at a restaurant Mrs. Yoon had used for exactly this kind of delicate negotiation for over 2 decades, the Song family elder arriving alone, without the visible security details Sungmin had half expected. The old man studied Sungmin for a long moment before speaking, his expression carrying the particular weariness of someone who had spent decades carrying a grievance he'd never fully resolved. I am ashamed, he said finally, that men serving under my own authority acted against my explicit wishes this morning. The debt closed at midnight, exactly as our tradition requires. I gave no order to violate that closure, and I have already dealt with the men responsible. I appreciate that a great deal, Sungmin said carefully. But I would like to understand something that has troubled me for 12 years. My father believed your family targeted mine because of a debt tied to my mother's death. I have never once heard your family's version of that history. I would like to hear it now, directly, if you're willing to share it. The Song elder was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind his careful expression. Your father believed we killed your mother, he said finally. That belief shaped an entire generation of hostility between our families. I have carried the burden of that belief for 18 years, watching it poison every interaction between us, watching it eventually reach forward into threatening a child who had nothing to do with any of it. Are you telling me it isn't true? Sungmin asked, something cold settling into his chest. The old man met his gaze steadily. We did not kill your mother, he said. We lost an heir the same year your mother died, under circumstances we always believed were connected, which is why the assumption of mutual blame took root so easily between our families. But in the years since, my own investigators have uncovered evidence I never shared with your father, because by the time I understood the truth, the hostility between our families had already calcified into something neither of us seemed willing to examine too closely. What evidence? Sungmin said, his voice tightly controlled. The same person who arranged for our own heir's death that year also arranged for your mother's, the Song elder said. Someone who benefited considerably from both families believing the other was responsible. Someone who understood that mutual suspicion would keep our organizations permanently divided, unable to compare notes closely enough to ever discover the truth. Soo-min's hand found Sungmin's beneath the table, steadying him as the full weight of this revelation settled over the room. How long have you known this? Sungmin asked, something sharp and disbelieving entering his voice despite his effort to remain composed. 6 years, the elder admitted, meeting his gaze without flinching from the admission. I have carried that knowledge in silence, telling myself the timing was never right, that revealing it would only reopen wounds neither family had finished healing. I understand now that silence was its own kind of failure, no different in its consequences than the assumption my organization built an entire feud around 18 years ago. 6 years, Sungmin repeated. You could have told my father before he died. I could have, the elder said. I did not, and I have no excuse that makes that choice easier to hear. Only the honest admission that fear of reigniting a war I hoped was finally cooling kept me silent longer than it should have. Who is responsible? Sungmin asked. Do you at least know that much? I don't have a name, the Song elder admitted. Only a pattern my investigators traced years later, financial movements connected to both deaths, routed through intermediaries designed specifically to be untraceable. Whoever orchestrated this benefited from the war between our families continuing indefinitely. I have spent years wondering who that person actually was, and why they wanted our two families locked in mutual destruction badly enough to engineer both tragedies so carefully. Sungmin sat in stunned silence, 12 years of assumed history rearranging itself entirely for the second time in a single day. His father had built an entire strategy around protecting his family from the Song family's supposed vengeance, had sacrificed 12 years of his son's happiness to that belief, all while the actual architect of both tragedies remained entirely unidentified, possibly still active, possibly still benefiting from a war that had never needed to happen at all. My father needs to know this, Sungmin said quietly. Except he's been dead for 12 years, unable to ever learn how badly he'd misunderstood the threat he spent his final years protecting us from. Your father made the best decision available to him with the information he had, the Song elder said. I do not say that to excuse the years of hostility his belief caused. I say it because I understand, now more than ever, how easily two families can be turned against each other by someone patient enough to let assumption do the work violence usually requires. He rose slowly, extending a formal bow toward Sungmin, Soo-min, and finally toward Yerin, who had watched the entire conversation with the same careful, evaluating attention she'd shown her father since their first meeting that morning. The debt between our families is officially closed, the Song elder said. Whatever grievance either side believed justified 12 years of fear, I hope tonight marks the beginning of understanding it was never as simple as either of us believed. Later that night, after the Song elder had departed and Yerin had finally, exhausted from the longest day of her young life, fallen asleep in a guest room down the hall, Sungmin and Soo-min sat together on the estate's quiet terrace, 12 years of separation finally beginning to feel like something they might actually navigate together rather than simply mourn. "Do you believe him?" Soo-min asked. "About someone else being responsible for both deaths?" "I don't know," Sungmin admitted. "I want to believe my father's entire sacrifice, your entire sacrifice, wasn't built on a mistaken assumption someone else deliberately engineered. But I also can't ignore the possibility that whoever did this is still out there, still benefiting from exactly the kind of confusion that kept our families at war for 18 years. What will you do?" "Find them," Sungmin said. "Carefully, this time. Not the way I would have 12 years ago, moving loudly enough to make every enemy aware of exactly what I valued most. I've learned considerably more restraint than that in the years since." He looked at her, something steady and certain settling into his expression despite everything still unresolved. "But not tonight. Tonight, I only want to sit here with you and our daughter down the hall, finally safe, finally together, and let myself feel exactly how much I've missed this before I go looking for whatever danger still remains out there." "I understand that impulse completely," Soo-min said quietly. "I spent 12 long years learning to separate what mattered most from what could simply wait. Tonight, I agree completely. This can wait until morning comes." She rested her head against his shoulder, the two of them sitting in silence for a while, listening to the quiet sounds of the estate settling around them. 12 years of careful distance finally beginning to feel like something survivable rather than something permanent. Soo-min leaned into him, 12 years of careful distance finally dissolving into something considerably simpler. "I can live with that," she said quietly. Neither of them noticed the small, unmarked envelope that arrived at the estate's gate an hour later, delivered by a courier no one on the household staff could later identify or trace, addressed simply to Cho Sung-min in handwriting that matched nothing in any of his father's old correspondence. Inside, when his head of security finally opened it the following morning, was a single photograph, Sung-min's father, considerably younger, standing beside a man neither Mrs. Yoon nor anyone else on staff immediately recognized, taken the same year both his mother and the Song family's heir had died. The photograph itself looked ordinary enough at first glance. Two men standing outside a building, neither location tagged nor context explained. The kind of image that might have meant nothing at all if it hadn't arrived exactly one day after 12 years of careful silence had finally broken.